Have you seen me dice bag? The Grognard Files.
Hello, my name is Dirt the Dice, and this is the Grognard Files podcast, talking bobbins about tabletop RPGs from back in the day. I'm coming live from my den under the stairs in Dirt Towers in Adlington, Chorley, in the northwest of the UK, where, according to a recent review, you can expect dry humour and accents. Here in my den, I'm surrounded by my accumulated collection of RPG stuff. To my right is my great library of RPGs, which continues to expand despite myself, and my Grognard Files. For this episode, I've surrounded myself with little booklets of joy. Folded paper, staples and ink hold together the artifacts from a bygone age. This episode is all about the fanzine and the fanzine back in the 1980s. Here at the Grognard Files, we like to look back to look forward, and there's nothing better than fanzines and postal games to anticipate the glorious ethos of "here comes everybody" of the internet. Some of these zines even made it to the difficult third issue. We've got Next Stop Jupiter, the Journal of the Senseless Carnage Society, Runestone, Lankmar Daily Star, Verbal Diarrhea, Burning Rubber, The Role-Playing Kama Sutra, The Fiery Cross, Chaos Lord, Take That You Fiend, Tempestuous Orifice, and much, much more. To my left is my ridiculous homemade shrine to the actor Caroline Munro. I'll just give it a tap. Fantastic. Once again, she's the journalist in Adamant's Goody Two Shoes video. Not so subtle innuendo is what we're all about here at the Grognard Files. If you've been reading my blog at grognardfiles.com in June 2017, you'll know that I've been to the UK Games Expo for the first time. And if you listen to the Released podcast, episode 22, you'll hear me being overexcited about the experience. I don't get out much. While I was there, I was struck by how the Byzantine the hobby continues to be. Indie, OSR, Edition Wars, Story, Trad, Dice, One Dice, Diceless, a myriad of genres and hacks. And I introduced myself to a few people and told them about what I did. Oh, I don't really listen to podcasts. Or, yeah, the Grognard Files. Well, I don't really see myself as a grognard. Now, I'm not mentioning this because I felt they should know about the podcast, but it did make me realise that there's little wonder that fanzines and fan activity emerged from the hobby, as the gaming industry has little hope of satisfying its weirdly diverse participants. Fanzines served a niche within a niche within a niche, in the same way that self-publishing, blogging and podcasting does now. All fan activity in all hobbies have an important role. They create energy and enthusiasm to sustain things when the ebbs and flows of market forces threaten to destroy it. In the face of demands of attention on potential gamers, with the advent of computer games, the changing demographics of the market, and the sometimes inability of games publishers to avoid overreaching themselves and collapsing, it has been the fans that have kept RPGs going for so long. As well as keeping the hobby alive back in the 80s, the analogue world of zines was a hotbed of talent that would go on to shape the mainstream forces. In this episode, we're very pleased to interview Ian Marsh, who, along with Mark Gascoigne and Mike Lewis, created DragonLords zine before joining Games Workshop to shape the hobby in the mid to late 80s. Ian went on to become the editor of White Dwarf, and in this two-part episode he talks about that experience. DragonLords ran for 22 issues and was a mix of RPG ideas, news, reviews, interviews, and great art from the likes of Hudson Shaw. It was the birthplace of Red Fox and VOP comic strips, but it was also noticeable for its blisteringly raw letters page and irreverent schoolboy humour that poked fun at the industry and fan figures of the day. Take this piece that featured humorous magical items. It contained something about Tim Olsen, who was one of our visiting contributors in episode 12, manager of the Dalling Road branch of Games Workshop back in the day. It goes like this. The Olsen Scroll. This tiny, stained, ancient piece of parchment contains the last earthly writings of the venerable Oriental bard Olsen. The ancient runes can be deciphered to render the following. When I was young in fair Baltimore, I never passed by the cake shop door, and now I'm settled in London town, 6 Big Macs I have downed. Well, in this part of the episode, Ian Marsh opens the box on his experiences in RPGs and how DragonLords fanzine, with its funny, irreverent and inventive content, took hold of the imagination of British RPG scene, and how he became editor of White Dwarf. Then we have another superb contribution from @Daily Dwarf from Twitter. For this episode only, he becomes the Daily Dagon, as he talks about the contribution that Dagon fanzine made to the emergence of Call of Cthulhu as an important game. They say it's called Dagon, but it'll always be Dagon to me. Judge Blythy joins me in the room of role-playing rambling to talk about postal games. The origins of RPG zines is in PBMs, so we talk about our sometimes painful memories. I'll be back at the end of the podcast to bang on about our next Grognard File zine. You do realise that the reason I do this podcast in the first place is because I'm a frustrated zine editor. Ramblers, let's get rambling.
Open box with Ian Marsh.
Welcome to Open Box, where we open the box on the past, taking ourselves back in time to the halcyon days of the early 80s, before whizzing forward to the present to reflect on how the past has still remained with us. In this episode, it's a great honour to welcome Ian Marsh, one of the key players in the UK gaming scene in the early 80s. Writer, games designer, gaming entrepreneur, and of course, editor of DragonLords fanzine and White Dwarf. Hello, Ian.
Hello.
I didn't miss anything off your CV there, did I?
Probably embellished it rather, but yes.
Okay then, Ian, let's start at the very beginning then. So how did you get started in the hobby?
Well, I started doing wargaming. I took some Airfix soldiers to school one day to show a friend, and while I was doing that, someone behind me said, "Do you know you can play games with those?" And this is in 1972 or something. And that ended up with me going to the school's War Games Club on Friday evenings. Then later on, Minithigs released their Mythical Earth range of figures, and another War Games group started up in the school to do fantasy War Games with those. And that's basically where I met Mark and Mike. It's sort of, there's a group of us who just played fantasy war games, and we played something like, I think it was FGU Citadel, which was a sort of little tower adventure in a tower game. It's really ancient, and then on to D&D, and that's it. You know, it suddenly caught hold as an idea, and I stopped playing conventional war games and started obviously role playing using miniatures. I was delighted that I had to paint only one miniature at a time rather than 24, and I think I vowed never to paint another battalion of toy soldiers again. However, vows obviously get broken.
So this transition into D&D and playing the white box game, were you the GM or were you mainly the player?
I was mainly the player at that time. because it was being introduced to us by, I think, Mark. Basically, he was refereeing all the time, but basically that was over a period of 2 years before I went off to university. At which point I introduced it to Surrey University's War Games Club, and I think the first session I had about 30 players turn up to learn about D&D, and it reduced fairly soon to a core of manageable numbers, but there was certainly a lot of interest in it when I went to university. But we basically at university we moved on to playing RuneQuest after a while again, because I came back over the summer holidays, and Mike had gone on to playing RuneQuest, and so that one took over. As how it goes with games, every new system that comes out, you get to try, although I don't think we ever went through chivalry and sorcery. But certainly I think looked at Tunnels and Trolls and stuff, but basically it's fairly mainstream with D&D and RuneQuest.
So at what point does DragonLords appear?
DragonLords starts getting mentioned when I'm still at school. Mark, I believe, had seen a copy of Troll Crusher fanzine, basically shown it to Mike and joke about it being, let's do it, let's start a fanzine. But that's basically how it was. We'd got the idea that they were going to do a fanzine, but it took a long time to get going because I think what they wanted to do changed from week to week, and so I went off to university. I think I'd gone through 1 year of university before they actually decided that they were going to produce it, and issue 1 came out. There's a very few copies of DragonLords #1 where everyone who has worked on it signed the front cover. I wasn't an editor at that point. I was a contributor, but I contributed so much for the next issue that they just basically said, would you like to be an editor? And also I had an attractive student grant to help finance it. So,
And what was the print run, Ian, those early editions?
It could only have been about a couple of hundred.
Yeah.
I mean, even at its peak, DragonLords print run was 450, 500. That's in the later years.
Which explains why it's so difficult to get hold of, because I've got one here and it says price 50p on it, but if I wanted to sell it now, it would be a lot more than that, I think.
I've seen them priced at well over £100 for certain editions. Whether anyone actually achieves that is something else. Very odd to think that what are some quite immature writings of when you're a teenager or in your early 20s can suddenly be worth a vast amount of money to someone just because the magazine is what it is. I mean, I'm sort of always quite proud of what I wrote anyway, but it's odd to feel it's valued that highly when it is just a small niche in a niche hobby.
So for people who've not seen DragonLord, how would you describe it?
In glowing praise, it's just an A5 double-sided magazine full of irreverent role-playing humour as well as some useful bits for your role-playing game. Very much reliant on fan art. Hudson Shaw provided quite a bit. There's lots of lovely little quirky animals. I drew a few things, mainly because Mark and Mike said, can you draw a duck? And I drew one was not very sophisticated. And there's a few other bits of my artwork later in the magazine. But also we got to get some really spanking artists. Pete Martin, who did some fantastic black and white work. Really talented guy. It was a pleasure to get his art each issue. And I think that set a quite good artwork compared with some of the other
Hudson Shaw was the ones that made DragonLords quite distinctive, wasn't it? So there are a lot of people who listen to the podcast who are a fan of ducks in Glorantha, and they were really his speciality, weren't they? So what I've got here, thanks to Shop on the Borderlands, I've got a copy of issue 7 actually.
Right.
And what I noticed, because I got some of the later ones, I think, when probably when the print run was higher. I picked up some at Games Day, and I think you can see the transition from the early ones, which were very D&D focused, to later ones which had more Chaosium content. But this issue 7 perhaps give people a flavour of what was in there. So we've got an article here by Paul Mason on how to make Chivalry and Sorcery playable.
I don't think he ever succeeded in arguing that one.
I don't think he did.
Paul is a very good friend. Obviously, he became my editorial assistant later on White Dwarf, but he's been quite pivotal in shaping a number of things I've done.
There's also also an article on here by Ian Marsh about Grenadier figures. So were you always attracted to the miniatures?
I think, well, obviously, because I've started with modelling and moved on to toy soldiers. I mean, sort of toy soldiers have always been a big thing. I have no shame in calling them toy soldiers, because even though that's not what you can call them for CE marks because of the lead content of some of them. That's what they are, and I don't think anyone should be ashamed of going, I play with toy soldiers. They may be fine metal miniatures, but they're toys as well. But yeah, the miniature side of it's always been good. I think it's also because I had an interest in photography. Again, it's one of those things I did at school. The big issue on any fanzine was illustrative content. Either because you couldn't draw, or you couldn't find artists, or you couldn't get photographs done. And we used an offset litho printer, so we could get pictures properly dot screened for reproduction in a magazine. Figures reviews are more possible, although I think I would have killed for a digital camera and desktop publishing back then. Because DragonLords is basically all done the hard way with manual typewriters, and there's a ridiculous period when I think I justified the text using a manual typewriter. The process of doing that is basically writing out the text on a grid first and working out where you need to put extra spaces. But it is something you can only do if you've got the time and dedication. But it gave flush edges so you had justified looking type, and I think it helped improve the look of the magazine at some time.
Yeah. Tell the kids today that, and they wouldn't believe you, would you?
Yeah, I was nuts. And probably still am. But yeah, I think that's the hint of what I should have got on to do, and which is to do production of magazines, which I after I left White Dwarf, that's basically what I went on to do for 20 plus years as a journalist. So
perhaps we'll talk about that later. I mean, you mentioned the irreverent tone, and I think me as a 12-year-old, 13-year-old back in the day, that was what drew me to DragonLords, because you always had a kind of an editorial line that kind of took on some of the figures. Some of whom I didn't know who they were, but but they, you kind of took them on and kind of made fun of them. Particularly like Louis Pulsifer, for example, and people like that.
Yes, probably still the dullest person in the universe. I'm sorry if he's still around, but yeah, it's dear. Yeah, there's a certain style of writing, and I've come across it many times, and you go, why is this used? And you go, when you become an editor of a magazine, you go, because I've got a page to fill.
Yeah.
And it's not terrible, is the thing. Oh gosh, is it Louis Pulsifer who designed Britannia, the board game?
Yeah, I think it was.
Yeah, I think that was one of his finest ever creations. So having gone, writing. Britannia was one of the most enjoyable board games I think I've played. It provided many hours of fun. But yeah, so it just shows different talents. You can design a decent board game. It's It's good.
But as well as making fun of people, he also had articles which I suppose it reflect the spirit of the 80s. And when you read them now, you kind of take a sharp intake of breath. I think in this issue 7, for example, got women in D&D. I'm going to read a bit. I'm not judging you. Don't worry. I'm going to read a bit here. I read this morning. I thought it was funny. History. So this is like a character class for women in D&D. It is well known that in the Middle Ages, women were put in their rightful places by the gallant nobility. For this reason, we only allow women into dungeons wherein there are kitchens.
I don't remember any of this.
Like I say, I'm not judging you.
Oh dear. Well, we were teenagers, or very young, and again, part of it is tongue in cheek. It's designed to inflame and get comment. I think that's something that is evident from the letters pages of DragonLords. That I know it's terrible to say it, but you'll say something you don't necessarily believe in order to stimulate debate. Because again, well, perhaps you do want discussion of a point. I know women in D&D, it's a good thing to discuss, and you want people's opinions on it. And if you have to take a particular stance to get an opinion, I think it's also the knockers debate. I think which I think I manipulated during DragonLords history, to the extent that Ian Gibbs did a strip on it about a door which had a huge pair of breasts on it, and seeing as opening it was the key. It was basically to manipulate the knockers. It's a stupid door joke really. But again, it's it was there to try to fill the magazine with hopefully stimulating ideas.
And the letters page was probably the first page I always turned to, because you did get some pretty memorable rants in there, and like you say, some debate, picking up some finer point of an article in the previous issue.
I mean, the letters page was a vibrant part of Dragons, and of course that was, we didn't have the internet then. If you wanted to discuss anything to do with your hobby, the only means to do it was through magazines and fanzines, and White Dwarf's letters page was just a letters page, just one side of A4, which could barely cover anything. Again, it's something that changed when I started editing, because it went up to 2 pages. You didn't find out ideas unless you wrote in, and people were quite happy then to spend hours typing out letters. And then, of course, we'd pick something out of a 2-page letter and use it completely out of context to make them look daft, and inflame them and get more writing. It's terrible to say manipulating your readers, but that's what it is. I think any magazine or letters page editor wants response from their readers, and the only way of getting it is to encourage them to say. And you eventually come up with people who are clearly very good thinkers on this particular sort of games and games design, and you sort of get to know them and eventually get them to write for you.
One last thing on DragonLords. The other notable feature in there was your convention reviews, and talking about the convention scene and some of the things that went on there. Now, you won't realise this, but in Bolton, I always saw you and Mark as kind of rock star figures. Because I've got in front of me here a photograph that appeared in an early White Dwarf of you both with a Games Workshop bag on your head.
Oh, that's Mike. Yeah, Mike and me. Mark would not put a Games Workshop or carry a bag on his head. It's publicity. It's basically it got our pictures into White Dwarf. That's publicity.
So what was going on there then? What the convention scene? Is that how you came to the attention of people in Games Workshop, or how did you make that?
Basically, the way of selling DragonLords is through small lads in White Dwarf, alas, no more, and by turning up at Dragon Meet and Games Day on the fanzine stand and ruthlessly selling the magazine. I think I was talking again to Mike about this, and he said, well, yeah, we basically stunned everyone because we wouldn't just stand there meekly waiting for people to pick up a copy and peruse it, but we'd basically stuff it in their hands and mug 50p out of them. But it got out, and of course people then read it, because they basically, it is part of a sales thing, is once you've got something in someone's hands, they've almost bought it, or as good as bought it. It's very hard to put something down when you've got it in your hands. So now you know that. You'll never buy anything from a salesman again. Yeah.
I'm making notes of that for my own fanzine. Yeah. I can learn from the best. So how did you make that transition into being, a player, a fanzine editor, into working for Games Workshop?
I did materials technology at university, which is not fabric, but in sort of metals, plastics, and ceramics, which I got severely put off by exposure to the real world, which was basically a quality control lab for IBM, where I put rubber belts for cash point machines into ovens to cure them, to get them to the right stickiness for cash points. And so we would give out the right amount of money instead of too much. There was a big problem with Lloyds Bank cash point machines back in the early 80s. And I was one of the cures for it. Other exciting things like putting sticky labels on steel plates and putting them in a salt chamber for a week to see if they fall off. And I think I decided at that point that materials science and I were not made for each other. I went back for my final year, and in that time, when it came to finals, I was editing the magazine at the time, and doing the magazine was far more important to me than revising for my finals, and that said, go into journalism, really. I think my tutor at the time had said, have you considered working in sort of games? And I said, there's not much money in it. There's very few opportunities. I left university, went back home to Deal in Kent for summer, and in that time I think White Dwarf had an advert for warehouse staff, when I basically started at Games Workshop in the warehouse, along with many other terribly well qualified people who had degrees in physics or astrophysics and whatever, but basically who were all games players, and obviously wanted to work for Games Workshop because I think it was pretty well the source of everything that was good in role playing at the time. It was when it was still a company with which sold D&D and RuneQuest and all the other role playing games, because it was importing them from the States. So it was a wonderful time to be in a workshop where you basically had everything there in the warehouse. I was there for about 3 months. I think because I've always been fairly numerate. I went and helped out in the accounts department occasionally for Games Workshop. This is when the accounts was done on Commodore PET computers, a cassette-based computer with a green screen. But anyway, so accounts were keen to grab me, but Stuart Warehouse said, look, don't jump at that one. Wait, there's something coming up in January. And that was basically being editorial assistant to Jamie Thompson on White Dwarf. I think were two of us in the running, and it's one of those things where you go, when you're asked what makes you particularly suitable for the job, and you go, duh. Do I have to answer that? Because I've been doing this for 3.5 years or 3 years, so I know what it's like to run a magazine. So basically, I started in the January of 1984 issue. Was it 51? I think my first name credit is as editorial assistant. I started at Workshop, and I think my dad was never particularly happy about it. My mum's wonderful, because she relates the story about how basically my dad came back for Christmas, and my dad said, well, how's it doing? You know, I don't suppose you're making very much. And I just put my Christmas pay packet on the table in front of him, and he shut up. Workshop used to give a bonus at Christmas time, so you've got a substantial amount of money. It makes up for being ruthlessly underpaid for the rest of the time, so they haven't changed there. It's not unique. I think so. My initial salary at Workshop was $3,400 a year.
My goodness, yeah. Back
in 1983, when I left on from Dwarf, I was only on $7,500 as editor. I moved into a sub-editor's job on a trade paper at $10,500. The level of pay is if you love a job, you often won't get paid for it, but many people know that.
This was post-Fighting Fantasy, wasn't it? So was Ian Livingstone very much engaged in editing the magazine, or did he just leave you to it?
I think Ian's was particularly engaged in editing a magazine after the first 12 issues. One thing that articles on Wikipedia or anything never cover is the role of the assistant editor on the magazine. The assistant editor has, by and large, been the editor in everything apart from names. So people like Andy Slack and Jamie Thompson have done all the work and got none of the credit for it, and yet they're the people who basically put White Dwarf together. I think Albie Fiore did as well, and John Sutherland, who was between me and Jamie. Basically, you don't get the credit. So, they should be credited as editors of the magazine. Similarly, my actual editorship of the magazine is more than the 3 issues I've got the title, because I'd been doing it for a year before then pretty well.
Ian Livingstone's role was just as a figurehead.
Yeah, well, yes, but he has a big company along with Steve. They've got projects such as Fighting Fantasy to deal with. Yeah. They're doing more than just a magazine. A magazine is there, after all, to sell their products, and you can entrust it to someone else. And as long as they are, by and large, doing a decent job of promoting what you stock. One thing that often comes up is the bizarre idea that White Dwarf stopped being independent and started only covering Games Workshop games. I mean, it's always only ever covered stuff that Games Workshop sold.
Yes.
Anyone who thinks it was that independent is mistaken. But by and large, as editor, you're left to your own devices about what to put in. So what you've got is stuff that's come into the warehouse for stock and for review. So your content is decided by the contents of the warehouse when it comes to new product and reviews. And it wasn't till fairly late in the procedure that there was start of an insistence to start including material on things. I know I certainly got told not to put any more Golden Heroes in because they were stopping the game, despite the fact that every time I put a Golden Heroes article or scenario in, the game sold more. But obviously it wasn't one of the biggest sellers. It's a shame because as a superhero role-playing game, I think it worked really well. It's Simon Burley had a good system, and I used to play it a lot at weekends in a fairly involved campaign.
And what do you think that you brought to White Dwarf then? So during that period when you were the assistant editor?
Punctuality, I can tell you that. When I turned up, it was about 3 months behind. Jamie is great. He's very creative. I think he's got, his Dark Lord books are quite wonderful, but he's always been a bit lazy, if he doesn't mind me saying that, and trying to get him to do stuff on time was impossible. So basically, my first job, basically turning up on Dwarf, was to start getting on time. I was very arranged because Jamie had too much work to do, so I started as editorial assistant doing the letters and everything. So dealing with contributors, and eventually when I moved on to assistant editor, is basically making sure it came out on time. And then also trying gradually to bring in the influences of fandom, because the various fanzines had produced some very good writers with some interesting ideas about role playing, and trying to get that thinking side of role playing into White Dwarf rather than it all being just stuff you could pick up and use. I think it is quite important for White Dwarf, and this is where I differed with Paul Coburn, is basically your readership is not all the thinkers, the radical fanzine people who are urging you to do things. It's ordinary people who don't necessarily have much time and want to be able to just play a scenario, and so they need something that comes out each month, so they've got something to play without much thought. Just the bits you want. Sometimes you just want to turn up, go, I can pick this up, I can do this, play it, and we're good for a month. So one thing I did in White Dwarf, I made sure, I think, while D&D was still popular, and made sure there was a D&D scenario each issue, and then an other scenario for a different system. So whether it's Golden Heroes, Call of Cthulhu Inquest, or whatever variety in the stuff that was easy to use. Also get rid of some of the stale bits, some of the departments particularly.
I think that's the bit that you can notice. So some of those regular departments and features seem to kind of go away at this point. And
I basically there are a lot of contributions to White Dwarf, particularly for Fiend Factory. Not all of high caliber. This is all stuff produced by small boys who produce ripping machines of monsters with no value other than to kill the party, and so not interesting. I'm sure it's fascinating when you create it, and there's basically a filing cabinet full of monsters from D&D players and whatever. Same for magic items and tricks and traps and all sorts. And I think all the department editors were finding it difficult to find stuff to go in. I think I'll put Dave Morris as the exception, because Dave will just write stuff as required. So he's very fertile as a player and writer and referee. So he can produce the goods when you need it. Dave is absolutely memorable, because my first encounter with him was when I was editorial assistant newly on the magazine, and he turned up at 10 in the morning for a chat with Jamie. He put his feet on the desk, pulled out half a bottle of whiskey and poured himself a glass. And I can't, it's just something you can't forget. So he made an impression. Of course, I went on later to go and play on Dave's Thursday night game in London, and Dave basically introduced me to TechUML as a role-playing background. Although Empire of the Petal Throne had obviously appeared in early issues of White Dwarf, it's never really been a big commercial set of rules, but it's just got the most fantastic background. And once you're developed as a role player, having all that to work with is just an incredible opportunity. So I think from Dave's games, I've ended up playing a long-running TechUML game for something like 10 years, under various systems. Dave's was based on Dragon Warriors, I think, which is his little book of fantasy role-playing rules and scenarios. Then GURPS didn't particularly work very well, and then one of the newer TechUML systems. But I say, unfortunately, I don't think any of them have had any real commercial success, despite the fantastic depth of background.
Just to fast forward to the present, do you still game on a regular basis?
Role playing, no.
So when did you stop role playing?
Well, basically, the trouble is I moved down to the Isle of Wight in 1999, which basically I lived in Wandsworth, not far from where the old Airfix factory used to be, actually. And we all basically got different jobs or moved away. So 3 of the players are in America, 1 in Portland, 2 in Chandler. I think the referee's still somewhere in South London. That's one of the other players, and basically people moved away. Lee Brimickham Wood is another member of the group. You may know him from a number of his board games. He moved to Sweden for a period, and basically we all splintered. And we'd reached a good point, 10 years or so of playing with pretty well the same characters. Never particularly high powered, because the interest in the game was the background and the story, and the sheer terror and deference to Patrick Brady's refereeing style of some of the monsters. You don't even see it, but you're damn well afraid of it. It's just, there is one thing we go, we will never speak of that again, and we don't. So the problem is for role playing. I reached, I think, the natural conclusion of, I don't have a games group. Keep thinking about it occasionally now, but we must have stopped playing properly about 10 years ago. But that's it. So, but I think back in 95-ish, even though we'd stopped doing fanzines and I'd stopped being involved with fantasy magazines and such, we all used to continue the tradition of meeting up in pubs. So we used to have pub meets for role playing in various pubs across London. The Postal Gamers had the Lamb in Lamb's Conduit Street, and we went to the Sun. And one of these, I sort of met up with Mike again and said, I was thinking about starting back with Napoleonic wargaming, so going back to what I was doing in the early 70s. And he said, I just started that 6 months ago. And so we got going with Napoleonics, back playing with Bruce Quarry's Napoleon's campaigns in miniature, because basically that's a set of rules we'd left off with, which were incidentally the rules that put me off Napoleonic wargaming. But that's what we had. And then we gradually evolved and playing things like Shaco and PK and so on. So I sort of had restarted conventional wargaming at that point and got my interest back in sort of toy soldiers, and as I said, started painting battalions of toy soldiers again.
Well, if we've gone back to where you started, that seems a good point for us to end this part of the interview. And we're going to come back, and you're going to face the Games Master screen. So until next time, Ian, thank you very much.
Thank you very much.
Daily Dwarf.
Crawling at you. Dagon. The thing about Dagon is this. One is liable to run out of superlatives. Not my words, but those of horror writer and Cthulhu Mythos iconoclast Brian Lumley. Just what was it about this Call of Cthulhu gaming fanzine that, from relatively humble beginnings, quickly transcended its origins to become a multiple British Fantasy Award-winning publication, so that, even now, decades after its last issue, it's still spoken of in tones of hushed, reverential awe. Well, by me at any rate. It's time to enter the esoteric world of Dagon. Carl T. Ford started his Call of Cthulhu fanzine back in 1983 as a way to share his scenarios with fellow gamers. His scenario, No Room at Innsmouth, was split over the first 3 issues, and the fanzine became a popular seller in the Dalling Road branch of Games Workshop. Now, as I mentioned in the Call of Cthulhu episode of the Grognard Files, I first heard of Dagon in the news pages of White Dwarf magazine. Come on, I had to get a mention of White Dwarf in here somewhere. By sending the princely sum of £4.50 to Mr. Ford in deepest, darkest Twickenham, a 6-issue subscription could be yours. I only started reading H.P. Lovecraft relatively recently at that time, and I never played Call of Cthulhu RPG, but for some reason that escapes me now, I decided to take the plunge and subscribe. I'm so very glad that I did. By the time I started subscribing, with issue 13, Dagon had already become a very professional-looking publication. If there's one word to sum up Dagon, it's this: quality. Sure, it had the staple features of other zines at the time: news, reviews and letters, which contained contributions from the likes of Robert Bloch and Ramsey Campbell, as well as regular missives from one Mike Mason. I wonder whatever happened to him. But the quality of the content, both gaming and fiction, the quality of the contributors, the quality of the art and the production values meant that it stood head and shoulders above its contemporaries. What other fanzine could boast contributors of the likes of Ramsey Campbell, Neil Gaiman and Thomas Ligotti? What other fanzine could command regular gaming column from Mr. Sandy Peterson himself? Or scenarios from the likes of Mark Morrison and Penelope Love? Consider the sheer quality of the art. The beautiful, crisp, monochrome production of the fanzine was perfect showcase for the dripping, tentacled excesses of Dave Carson, the alien savagery of Alan Kozowski, the brooding shadows of Martin McKenna, and the weird cosmic vistas of Dallas Goffin. From the front cover to the back, every issue of Dagon simply exuded quality. And remember, folks, this was all well before digital desktop publishing. Carl bashed out each issue on a manual typewriter. Fiction. My first issue of Dagon, number 13, was the first to feature a glossy Astrolux cover. Maybe to celebrate this step up in quality, the issue was the first special devoted to the works of a single author, in this case, Brian Lumley. As an aside, I sometimes detected a bit of a sniffy attitude in some circles to Brian Lumley and his take on the Cthulhu mythos. I should say it's not one I share. I've always enjoyed his writing, and the story, Fruiting Bodies, remains one of my favourite weird tales. The author special format was then repeated in later issues for T.E.D. Klein and Thomas Ligotti and the weird monger himself, D.F. Lewis. As time wore on, Dagon tended to focus more on fiction, although, as we see, even in the issues that were dedicated to the writings of particular authors, it still contained some great material for the Call of Cthulhu RPG. When it came to fiction, though, Dagon seemed dedicated to introducing writers to its readership. While T.E.D. Klein was an established writer, I'd never heard of him prior to the double issue dedicated to his work. Thomas Ligotti is now a well-known horror writer, but when he was granted the honour of a special double issue back in 1988, as far as I'm aware, his collection Songs of the Dead Dreamer was only available in hard-to-find edition from the little-known US publisher Silver Scarab Press. What's all the more impressive, of course, is this was all done prior to the advent of the internet. I've often wondered just how Carl Ford became aware of these various writers and their stories, and then persuaded them to contribute to the magazine. As with all other facets of the fanzine, the standard of the fiction of Dagon was very high. Two standouts for me were the Journal of J.P. Drapeau by Thomas Ligotti in issue 20 and Diggory Smalls by D.F. Lewis in issue 24. The Journal of J.P. Drapeau is a quintessential Thomas Ligotti. The story's journal structure provides an episodic, fragmented narrative conjuring an hallucinatory atmosphere in which neither the reader nor the narrator can be confident of the line between dreams and reality. The narrator's sense of isolation is palpable. Although the journal entries are dated, the situation seems to take place out of time. Ligotti makes a playful spin on the Lovecraftian idea of the true reality hiding just out of view. This tale has the power to unnerve the reader with powerful use of some arresting imagery that brings to mind German expressionist cinema. Reading it back in 1987, it was a forceful introduction to the works of this compelling author. D.F. Lewis announced himself to Dagon readers with a disquieting prose poem, Foxflesh, in issue 17, but his story, Diggory Smalls, is my favourite from all those published in Dagon. Having first read it in 1989, it's been lodged in the dusty attics of my brain ever since. The story mixes the unsettling horror motifs with jet black humour in describing the journey of William Fitzsimmons and his mutant grandchild, Diggory Smalls, up through the reaches of their isolated ancestral home to find, well, that would be telling. There are echoes of both Mervyn Peake and Lovecraft's The Outsider in this tale, the creation of an inner world wholly cut off from reality, but the style is uniquely Lewis's. The dark humour works particularly well, I think, in keeping the reader off guard, a technique also used by Ramsey Campbell. Lewis never overplays the humour though, maintaining a Magnus Mills-esque deadpan delivery throughout. "Come on, Diggory, no time for larks." As the narrator states, not everything is contained within the frame of reality, a concept reinforced by a story within a story ending. Thoroughly recommended. Dagon also featured a number of author interviews. Brian Lumley, Ramsey Campbell, T.E.D. Klein and Thomas Ligotti were all put under the spotlight. In each interview, Carl Ford really dug into the motivations and inspirations of the author and examined the writer's process. They all made for a fascinating reading, particularly when contrasting the approaches and struggles of the different writers. The undoubted highlight, though, was an interview with Karl Edward Wagner in issue 25, titled Blow Lamps and Wicked Milk. Maybe it was because the interview was conducted in Dave Carson's flat, or maybe it was the presence of a bottle of Jack Daniels, but Carl struck up a real rapport with Wagner in a rare, wide-ranging and thoroughly entertaining interview. Karl Edward Wagner may be best known for the Kane fantasy novels, but he really opened up to Carl on all his work in the horror and fantasy genres. He tantalisingly mentioned a film collaboration with Sam Peckinpah that sadly never came to pass, as well as the time he unintentionally masqueraded as Clive Barker at a book signing. It's all given additional poignancy by the fact that Karl Edward Wagner died just a few years later. Gaming. As I've said, Dagon tended to concentrate more on fiction as time went on, but it never forgot its roots as an RPG fanzine. It was always there on the cover, for the players of Call of Cthulhu. None other than the author of said role-playing game, Mr. Sandy Peterson, wrote a gaming column in Dagon called The Acolyte. It was a mixture of news, rumours and gaming tips, short, punchy and always informative. Maybe unsurprisingly, Sandy would always cover upcoming Chaosium releases, but it was clear that Sandy also read Dagon, as he often responded in his column to articles and ideas from previous issues, such as a follow-up to an article on guns in Call of Cthulhu from Mark Morrison. Shoggoths don't kill people, guns do. Add in the odd bit of humour, such as the lyrics to a well-known Australian song, Waltzing Cthulhu, and it always made a fun read. When it came to Call of Cthulhu scenarios, Dagon readers were spoiled for choice. Andy Bennison had many published over the years and had ideas very much ahead of their time. He wrote several single-player scenarios years before Cthulhu Confidential was even a twinkle in Robin D. Law's eye. Scenarios such as The Body on the Beach, where players familiar with the mythos are tricked into seeing things that aren't really there, and The Last of the Clan Macmere, a kind of Alone Against the Cultists, were well received by the readership. For me, though, his best scenario was You in Your Small Corner in issue 20, with its bleak, no-win premise and an inevitable descent into despair. It foreshadowed the ideas pursued in Graham Walmsley's recently kickstarted Cthulhu Dark. It seemed to divide opinion on the letters page, generally well received, but some didn't like the fact that there was no escape for the players. It struck me, though, as a great atmospheric recreation of a Lovecraftian tale. Also, the scenario broke the fourth wall by including the actual stories of the Cthulhu mythos within the game world itself. Ultimately, the last word on this scenario should go to Thomas Ligotti, who commented in the letters page, Very entertaining and instructive on the essentials of horror, and the title is excellent, worthy of Ramsey Campbell. After reading that, I wonder if Mr. Benison ever came down from that particular high. Mark Morrison contributed an outstanding scenario in each of the 2 author specials devoted to T.E.D. Klein and Thomas Ligotti. In both, he eschewed the Monster of the Week approach to many scenarios that appeared in Fanzine, and instead crafted adventures of subtle, brooding horror that really captured the voice of the writer in the issue's spotlight. I've spoken about his Ligotti-inspired scenario, In a City of Bells and Towers, on the Grog Pod before. Suffice to say, it is very unsettling setup. The PCs experience a dreamlike shifting dark night of the soul as they wander into an unnamed city in old Europe, unsure of their grasp on reality. The scenario, inspired by T.E.D. Klein, Landscrapes, is simply marvellous. The same issue contained Mark Morrison's article, Keeping a la Klein, in which he discussed recreating Klein's worldview in the game, how to build a satisfying climax without the straightforward big bad monster encounter, foreshadowing events to throw players off guard, and not leaving the players with easy explanations. He then put all this advice to use in Landscrapes, where the players experience the conflict between the city and the country as their investigators are stranded in an isolated farm. Events rapidly escalate as the PCs are threatened by a fecund, perverse nature running riot. It brought to mind Klein's short story, The Events at Pooreth Farm, while still maintaining a style all of its own. Fantastic stuff. So good, in fact, that it made recommended reading list in 1988's Year's Best Fantasy and Horror. There are so many other highlights I haven't mentioned. The Return to Arkham comic strip, a collision of Brian Lumley's words and Martin McKenna's art in a gloriously over-the-top cautionary tale. The moral presumably being that you can't choose your family. Penelope Love's beautifully written Call of Cthulhu scenario, Wild Beasts. Harry O. Morris's chilling illustration for the story of Autumn Horror in the Ligotti special. Stacey Clark's comprehensive list, The Books of the Cthulhu Mythos. The list goes on and on and on. And suddenly, the Dagon press stopped rolling. Issue 28 promised to cover the Polish writer Stefan Grabinski, an H.P. Lovecraft anniversary special, where various writers discussed their favourite Lovecraft stories, was also planned. But sadly, they never materialised. If you want to get hold of copies of Dagon now, you have to head to eBay. Having previously cast the spell, Summon Cash. For those who remember Dagon back in the day, there's also a Friends of Dagon Press group on Facebook. I like to think, though, that there's an alternative dimension. Dagon continued to be published, went from strength to strength, and Carl Ford received the fame and adulation he so richly deserved. But even in this more mundane reality, maybe the Dagon fanzine is not dead, but merely dreaming, just waiting until once more it can unleash its arcane, esoteric influence over us all, when the stars are right.
Open box!
Welcome to Open Box. I'm in the room of role-playing rambling with Blythy. Hello, Blythy.
Hello, Dirk.
Now, maybe we should be in separate rooms for this one, sending each other reminiscences in missives.
Separate houses.
Separate houses,
Separate countries.
Creating a great chain of replies and responses from the past to the present, because we're talking about postal games, PBMs. Now, Blythy.
Dirk.
You're going to have to help me here.
Yes.
You know, don't you?
I know. You're psychologically scarred by postal gaming, aren't you?
Now, I've been treated for post-traumatic stress when it comes to postal games. We'll come on for the reasons for that.
Post-traumatic stress. Very
Very
good. The people say I labour the jokes. Listen to that.
I've had post-traumatic stress counselling to help me through postal games. You know, I believe I've spoken to my therapist, Tony Bulb, and he tells me, I'll be all right.
Yeah.
But if I get too far, I've got to say a safe word.
Okay, what's that?
Well, what do you think? I don't know. Any suggestions?
I don't know.
Fish fingers.
Fish fingers? Fingers? I don't like you saying fingers.
Yeah.
We've been through this before. It gives me post-traumatic stress. The time he kept saying fingering.
Fish fingering. Fish fingering.
Fish fingering?
That's
even more upsetting than the very idea of it.
If I get anxious, I might say fish fingering. You're just going to have to be ready for that.
Well, in that case, I'll take no action. I want if the safe word's fish fingers, I expect fish fingers to be said. By the way, that's 2 words. That's 2 safe words.
Yeah, well, you can't be too sure, can you?
Oh.
Right. Here we go. So, I'm talking about postal games and PBMs. So I think this is in the period around 1984 when we left school.
Yes. Yeah.
I think when we've been talking in the podcast so far, we've been mainly talking about those very early years, haven't we?
This was a bit later, wasn't it?
Yeah. This was the halcyon days. This was a time when we were playing games all the time, weren't we?
Well, it was the time when we left school and went to college, and of course that gave us a lot more free time, largely because we didn't go to college, even though we were supposed to be at college. So we had a lot more free time, and of course we filled the free time. The vacuum was filled with gaming, wasn't it?
Yeah.
So it built up a kind of head of steam, really, didn't it?
Yeah.
Where, and I suppose as well, you get a little bit older, a bit more freedom, haven't you?
Yeah.
And
well, I think as well that time when we left school, so in the May or June we left school, up until starting college. I mean, students today would not believe this, but we were actually paid money to actually stay at home and play games.
It's a stupid concept that you could sign on the dole, couldn't you?
Yeah, we were signing
sign on the dole, and you also got a grant. Remember that?
Yeah. Well, we were signing on over the summer, getting paid to. It's a state sponsorship program for playing role-playing games.
It was really, yeah. It's funding the gaming economy, state funding of the game economy.
I think I've said before that it was a long-term investment, and people are reaping the rewards of it now with this podcast. They were paying for it.
Yeah, they are. Yeah.
So at that time when we were playing over that summer, we were looking at ways to supplement how we could play even more games, and we turned to postal games as a way of doing that.
Well, we did. It was the age-old problem which we've talked about several times in this podcast. This is the olden days before the internet, and also we didn't have cars. We didn't have access to a car, did we?
No.
So we couldn't travel any great distance. So there was that problem of finding more gamers and playing more games, and postal gaming, which you would see advertised in the back of White Dwarf.
Yeah.
Postal game.
They all have names in it, like Tribes of Crane.
Yes, yeah.
Starmaster.
And also just people putting their own small ads for their own postal games.
Yeah.
Which I'm sure we'll come on to. But there was that idea, wasn't there, that this seemed a perfect solution to the idea of not just playing more, because it wasn't really about playing more, it was about finding new people to play with and experience their way of playing the game.
Yeah.
Because there was 3 or 4 of us who would play regularly, and of course we had all the time in the world, so we could play endlessly. But there was still that desire, wasn't there, to see how other people did it, because we were in this vacuum. And that was and looking back on it, I think that was the feeling other people got. That's why people offered to run postal games, because it was an opportunity to kind of reach out and find other players in a world where, as we've said before, you could be the only person with a copy of RuneQuest in your town. You could be sitting there with a role-playing game thinking, well, I mind playing this, but no one will play it with me.
And even if there were people there, you didn't know they were there, because...
No, there was no way of finding them. This is it. It sounds like the Dark Ages, this, doesn't it? And so I feel like my dad talking about an age without the internet, where you were really just stuck on your own in a small town, you couldn't leave.
Yeah. I do think there was a part of it, though, that was like supplementing the habit.
Yeah.
You know, like these people who wear nicotine patches, not to
Yes.
replace smoking, but to help to get an additional kick on top of the 40 a day.
There was that.
Yeah.
Yeah, it was a way of getting more gaming in. Yeah, definitely.
I think it was you. You went for one of those professional ones, didn't you? Was it Krasimov's World? Or?
Yeah, I can't remember if it was Krasimov's World or Tribes of Crane. But what was interesting about it, and I think this kind of, it was almost the warning of what was to come.
Yeah.
In that I sent off for, I think it was Tribes of Crane. And of course what came wasn't a role-playing game. It wasn't a role-playing game at all. It was a kind of, like a postal game, but it felt like kind of computer game where you put in your moves. And I think they might have fed it into a computer, I'm not sure.
Yeah,
but it felt very much, it felt very much like kind of chess by post.
Yeah.
You know that idea? That
or I think it was more, for me, from what I can remember of it, it's more like an analogue version of Civilization.
Yeah, that's a good comparison. Yeah, it felt a bit like that. So it sort of left me cold a bit because it wasn't what I was after. It wasn't a role playing game. Yeah, no, I'm not sure about Krasimov's World. I'm not sure if that was. I don't think that was a role playing game as such.
No.
I think you played a party of adventurers. I might be wrong, but I think you played a party of adventurers, and even that felt like, well, it's not really role playing then, is it?
And I think a factor in those were that they weren't role playing games. They were more like turn based strategy games, weren't they? Where you could have an influence on the outcome of something.
Yeah.
And the other players you were in competition almost. I think.
Yeah.
But it was computer moderated.
That's right.
And it felt computer moderated, didn't it?
Yeah, and it didn't seem to be or feel like the kind of thing I was looking for. And I think there's a reason for that. And I think it's something that probably worked very, very well postally through the post. You know, it worked very well because it was designed specifically to be played in that way. I think that became part of the problem. That some of the games we wanted to play, I'm not quite sure how well they worked by post because I had a later experience playing D&D by post, which was quite funny.
Yeah. So tell us about this then. This was a guy in Northern Ireland.
There's a guy in Northern Ireland, yeah, and he played. I think he might have been in the back of White Dwarf. There was an advert for basic D&D, not advanced, basic. No. That seemed reasonable idea through the post. Don't want to get ahead of myself, do I? Playing advanced D&D, so stick to basic, in case the postal concept blows my mind. And it was D&D through the post, but the problem with it was. It was played like a game. It sounds ridiculous to say this was the problem, but you'll see why in a minute. It was played like a game of D&D. So there I was, and I don't know what. I can't remember if I played a party of adventurers or whether I was just one adventurer. But in any event, you know, you went down a corridor and you came to a door. So you'd say you've come to a door, and you'd think, okay, right, I'll listen at the door. You'd write back, I listen at the door. Put it in an envelope, write the envelope, put a stamp on, post it, wait for maybe a week, maybe a bit longer. You get an envelope back, you'd open the envelope, you say, here we go, I've listened at the door, open the envelope. You don't hear anything. Okay, right, I'll tell you what, I'll try and try the door. I try the door, put it in an envelope. Write the envelope out, put a stamp on, post it, go to the post box, post it. Yeah,
don't forget your stamped addressed envelope.
Oh yes, for the reply, of course, yeah. And then wait a week and then get a...
Go on, did it open?
It was locked.
The door's locked?
Door's locked. Okay, door's locked. Ooh, tell you what, I could try and pick the lock, couldn't I? You know, it's getting exciting now, isn't it?
Yeah.
I'm sure people listening on the edge of their seats have now got a choice. I could try and pick the lock. My thief could try and pick the lock. Or my burly fighter could try and kick it in. I can't kick it in. I'm getting a bit... Not that I'm getting frustrated. But I think I might just kick the door in.
Right. So you have to send that off?
You know what I did? I had to put it in an envelope. I had to write the envelope out, put a stamp and don't forget the stamped addressed envelope. Post out to the post box. Post it. And then wait for a week.
Go on.
Did he failed the roll. Didn't kick it in.
Oh.
Didn't kick it in. He'd failed.
So what did he do next?
I think I tore it into 1,000 pieces and didn't reply. Oh dear. But to me, it was an example. It's kind of funny, and of course there would have been ways around it. The way we were doing it was kind of silly, because really what I should have done is I'll listen at the door, I'll try the door. If there's no noise behind the door, I'll do this, I'll do that. You could have put a few more options in, but we didn't play it like that. And it did highlight to me fairly early on that it didn't quite work. No. It didn't work because it's a bit like what we talked about Roll20, playing online. And we've said how playing online is a slightly different experience. It modifies the experience. It's not like playing around a table. But in fairness to Roll20, it's not hugely different. But I think a postal game felt hugely different to playing it around a table, just in terms of the sheer the turns, the sheer glacial movement of it.
Well, I think shortly afterwards, you playing that, I responded to a small ad in White Dwarf, come to the arena, and what this was the Gladiators Gazette. It was a fanzine, that was a postal games fanzine where you could use all different systems, Tunnels and Trolls, RuneQuest, D&D, Dragon Quest was in there as well. And you could create a character in there, and you could take your character to the arena, and what it would do is you would pit yourself against NPCs in the arena, and it was possible to have a fighter and a gambler, so you could wage against the different battles that were coming on. And every month we'd get a fanzine, and it would describe the fights and that thing. Sometimes it took longer than that. If you've got the first Grognard Files fanzine, you'll be able to see pages from that, because I've written about it. But it took over my life, the Gladiator.
I remember this. Yeah.
This is where the rot starts to set in with me in Postal Game, because I was kind of captivated by it, because very soon after it started, it began to transform from being about fighting to being about the characters that people had generated. The gladiators had personalities, and it started to develop that they communicated with each other and formed allegiances and alliances, made enemies, and it was all done within this zine. It was like written in a way that was like completely gonzo.
Yeah.
And
well, I remember that, and I probably didn't think it quite as clearly as I'm thinking it now on reflection, but I think what was very apparent with the Gladiator Gazette was, again, it wasn't like a role-playing game. So it was founded on the idea of role-playing games and these rule sets that you've got and character generation and what have you. But I always remember those later issues of it, reading some of them, in your bedroom, and thinking that it's not like a role play. It's not like what we play around a table. It's very, very different. It worked. I think it worked, but it worked because in the same way that the D&D game I played didn't work, because it was small turns, come to a door, listen at the door, try the door, check for traps. Doesn't work because it's too slow. What Gladiators Gazette did was it went in the opposite direction, where it had a more of a broad brush approach, didn't it?
Yeah.
So it did things in a broader way, where the games master was rolling several dice per issue, and several things were happening.
Yeah, it was like 2 turns. I think you could describe 2 turns. So.
Yeah, but I think that's what was interesting, that it, again, whilst that worked, it didn't quite feel like
it didn't
around a table. It's not to say it wasn't fun, but it wasn't quite role play.
It captivated my imagination.
Yeah,
and I can't remember where the chronology is in this, because that's the problem with this, isn't it? It's like 30 odd years ago, but it was in that summer, and I'm going to do this now. Let me just have a quick cup of tea before I start this. Just to.
Are you sure? You can do this?
I think I can. So, I had this idea of running our own postal game.
You did?
Yeah. So we sat in my bedroom one sunny summer's afternoon, and we invented a world. And it was a great experience. So it was me, you and Eddie, and we invented a world.
We did.
And we created this land called Raklash.
Yes.
and it was an island that was built by the elements of light and dark, and it was where the gods battled on this island.
Very original.
Yeah, I think so.
Be careful what you say, but I don't want people stealing this idea. Very, very original.
So on this island, they had this pitched battle, and Ilnor, that's the light thing,
Yes.
struck down Darkor, that's the...
Is that what we called him?
Yeah.
Darko?
Ilnor and Darkor. It's good.
Yeah.
It's good. It leaves no room for ambiguity.
That's true. There's no mistaking it. Who's the god of darkness? Darko. Oh, right. I'll remember that.
So Ilnor throws a shuriken, a throwing star, at Darkor.
Yeah.
It's called the Sun Star.
Yeah.
And it strikes his chest and shatters, killing Darkor.
Yeah.
And he falls, and light.
Can we just remind people listening?
Yeah.
We were 15.
We were 15.
We were 15. I want that.
Yeah.
I want that noting. We were 15.
So the pieces of the Sun Star were scattered. I think we've watched Krull, haven't we? And
I think we'd watched Krull, and we were enraptured by Glorantha. So it's a weird combination of Krull and Glorantha.
Yeah. How can we make Glorantha so that we can understand it?
Yeah.
We'll write our own.
We'll write our own crap version of it.
Yeah.
And it'll be comprehensible.
Yeah. And then I think what we did then is split the island up. So the idea is that we would send people on a postal game. We would have 2 parties each. So you would games master for 2 parties. So you would have 2, Eddie would have 2, I would have 2. That's how it was going to work.
Yeah.
So
Why do I detect some sense of recrimination in your voice?
well, there's a high horse waiting in the wings.
Yeah.
Back. Wait for your cue, high horse. Right. So we came up with this island, and the idea was we would have a group of trolls, a group of elves, and some human things, and dwarves, and we'd create these parties of game masters, and it'd be a race to recover the pieces of the Sunstar. It'd be an epic campaign.
Yeah.
It would be easy because we were only doing 2 parties each.
Yeah.
Back. Right. So we wrote our advert on that afternoon. We created it because we'd all decided that we were going to do it, and we wrote this issue 59, White Dwarf. Are you ready for this?
Okay.
We counted out the words, got a postal order, sent it off to White Dwarf. Request PBM for 6 people. 6 people. 6 people it was for.
Yes.
On the island of Racklash. For information, send a stamped addressed envelope to my mum and dad's address.
Yeah.
So, we sent it off. Right, high horse, you can come in now. So we went to the post box, and it hadn't even hit.
I think it.
I don't know. It hadn't even hit the bottom of the post box when you and Eddie said, "I'm not sure I can do it. I don't really want to do it. Are you sure I can't do it?" So I ended up doing it on my own.
Well, yeah, you say that, and that puts me and Eddie possibly in a poor light.
It does, because
But me and Eddie don't have a safe word for when postal games are mentioned, do we? So who's the idiot now?
Anyway, it went off. It went off to White Dwarf, and I think forgot about it. Well, I think we forgot about it because something happened.
And it took a while for it to appear, didn't it?
It took months and months.
Yeah.
And at this time, it was a bad time because I think my mum and dad were a bit concerned that role-playing games were taking over my spare time.
Well, they were right.
They were right.
They were right. I mean, whether you should be concerned about that is a moot point.
Yeah.
But it's true. It did take over our lives.
Yeah. And I think the tipping point was when I ordered from the back of one of those Sunday supplement magazines. You know where you could get books for a pound.
Yeah, you joined a book club and you got
yeah.
like 7 books for £1. And then you had to buy 3 of them over the course of 12 months or something stupid like that.
An absolute bargain. For a 15-year-old, that seemed like
a good proposition.
Good proposition. Yeah. So I got them delivered to my nan's house.
Yeah.
And I joined this like mystery and magic book club.
That one.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Do you remember it? Yeah?
I do, yeah.
And it arrived Dictionary of Demons, Visions of the Occult, some tarot cards, and something else, a book on magic.
Yeah.
And I thought they made perfect supplements, these, for our role-playing days. They arrived at my grandma's, and I think it nearly sent her over the edge. So my dad wasn't best pleased at the time. And then, before I'd even got the copy of issue 59 of White Dwarf, it started. The envelope started dropping.
Yes.
At first it was 5, 6, 7. You know that scene in Harry Potter?
Yes.
Yeah. You know, Dumbledore wants to go to Hogwarts.
Yeah.
It started flooding in. 134 people had written to me to join this. And my dad said, "Are you starting a cult?"
What was he worried about? I mean, if you start a cult, you're usually all right. People who start cults benefit from it. It's people who join cults you've got to worry about. When you think about it, those 130 odd people, if you were starting a cult, they've got more to worry about than you as the starter of a cult or founder of a cult. Well, they tend to do all right out of it, don't they?
Yeah, say that to David Koresh.
Well, yeah, they're on mass suicide. Don't do well out of that, but generally speaking.
So I had all these 134 people who wanted to play. Now, a sensible person would have thought, no, there's 6 places.
You know what a sensible person would have done, don't you?
What?
The minute it hits the post box, I'm not doing it. Me and Eddie. That's what a sensible person would have done. Said, do you know what? This is a stupid idea. What would a person who's not sensible do? Do tell us, Dirk, what would a person who's not sensible do? I think we're going to find out, aren't we?
So a person who's not sensible... Fish finger? No. A person who is not sensible decides, right, I can't do it all.
Yeah.
So what I'll do is I'll do 24 of them.
Yes.
That's reasonable, isn't it? Because that's like...
Well, it seems that way when you say it. It seems that way when you say it, but a lot of things do when you just say them rather than have to do them.
So I only had to disappoint, you know, just over 100 of them. So it didn't feel so bad. So it started then, didn't it? I did it. Now I got it in my head. I didn't want it to be like your experience.
Yes.
I wanted it to be a bit more prosaic and a bit more of a narrative than the Gladiators Gazette experience.
Yeah. Which was the way to do it. I think we learnt that pretty quickly, didn't we? That was the way to do it, because doing it turn by turn by turn, dice roll by dice roll was just a non-starter, because it just took forever.
So I took the idea of doing it like a fighting fantasy. Choose options.
Yeah.
So I would write a paragraph, so they would say what they wanted to do.
Yeah.
And I allowed people to give 2 or 3 instructions of what they would like to do. And I responded, and I gave options at the end of it. So you may do this or you may do that. But obviously very quickly people said, well, I don't want to do any of those options.
Role players, you see. That's the whole thing with role players, isn't it?
Yeah.
They don't want to give to fighting fantasy style options. They want the freedom to do other things that they think are clever.
So what started off as paragraphs ended up being 4 pages. 2 pages.
I remember it, and I remember we were at college at the time.
Yeah.
And we sort of didn't go to college, stopped going to college, and
so I could write this.
So you could write those. I think at the time, did I start a Stonebringer one as well? I ran a Stonebringer one, didn't I?
Mr. Johnny Come Lately.
Yeah. But I was much more controlled and sensible about it.
And I was pulling all-nighters, writing these things. But people loved it. And
it feeds the...
It feeds it. And I created a newsletter, the National Kobold, and it kind of stoked up a lot of interest. People were really interested in it, and I was feeling... And the satisfaction I felt when I pulled an all-nighter and I put 10 through the post box the next day...
People were clamouring for it.
But those 10 would be back the next day because they wanted more. So I could never keep on top of it. You would never get on top of it.
Took over your life. You were like the David Cassidy of Postal Gaming, weren't you? Holed up in a room surrounded by fans wanting a piece of you. That's what you became.
Now, the sensible thing would have been to kind of row it back. But I started another campaign because I was enjoying it so much.
I think the phrase we're looking for here is you're only yourself to blame. I think you tried to pin it on me and Eddie for backing out, but I don't think you can do that anymore.
Yeah.
And you start another one, and you started the next one. That's not.
But after
silly.
it must have been about 12 months, it became too much. So I did what I always do in these situations.
Fake your own death.
I did. Yeah.
Yes. That's how this podcast will end. Eventually, when these podcasts come to an end, it'll be me tweeting, Dirk has now died. Found his clothes on Southport Beach.
Well, yeah, I just stopped.
But I think it's quite telling, though, isn't it, that it got like that, because it was that teenage obsession with RPGs and wanting to play more and more and more of them and fill your life with them. That's what we did at any given opportunity, didn't we? You know, we would do. We want to play role-playing games, and postal gaming was just another medium for doing that. You know. Yeah. But like you say, it gets slightly out of hand.
Yeah.
Very out of hand.
It did.
You'd have been better off joining a cult, actually. You'd probably come out of it better, in better mental shape than you are now. You wouldn't have fish fingers as a safe word.
Yeah. I think it came to a head the moment when I found myself in a room surrounded by bits of paper with paper clips, self-addressed envelopes, and I just thought, I might be wrong here, but I recall having conversations with you where you'd ended up putting the wrong things in the wrong envelopes at one point. People have then written back and said, "What are you talking about? What's going on?" I don't remember anything. It's like, "Oh no, put the wrong thing in the wrong envelope." Yeah. There's just so many of them.
Yeah, it became crazy. But again, I think it highlights, doesn't it? It's not just at the time, your obsession to get more gaming in, or my obsession to get more gaming in. It was about the fact there were other people in the country who felt the same. It is this thing that we've talked about a lot during these podcasts, that back in the day, back in the 80s, while some people, maybe if they were at university or they were part of a wargaming group, had regular access to people who wanted to play role-playing games, for a lot of people, it was a very solitary. Even though in a way, gaming is of course, it's not a solitary activity, is it? It's by definition requires other people to play the game with. But people found that difficult. They found, because it was a strange new thing, people didn't understand it, people didn't like it, people thought it was weird, whatever. People wanted to find players and couldn't, and that's why you got 130 odd people writing to you immediately, and that's why those people replied within 2 or 3 days of getting it. That's why they were doing it, because it's quite possible that some of those people had got a set of rules but just had no one to play with. And postal gaming was the key to that. Even though, as we said earlier, it did offer a different experience. It wasn't giving you quite what, for want of a better phrase, wasn't giving you an authentic role-playing experience. No. But it was giving you some kind of experience. And therefore, it was something people were very keen to do.
What about now then? So normally in this section, we start off in the past and kind of consider and reflect on the future. Would you play a play-by-email game, for example?
Well, we have tried that. We tried that, didn't we, a few years ago?
Yeah, we did actually.
It was about 10 years ago.
Yeah.
When we were both kind of bogged down with families and couldn't find anyone else to play with. We did a Call of Cthulhu thing by email. That worked reasonably well.
We used Yahoo groups, didn't we?
Yeah, that's right. Yeah, but I think it worked well, because I think the other thing that we've not said about postal gaming is I think some RPGs work better than others. Yeah. So we played Cthulhu by email or by message. We would message every other day or every few days. But the beauty of Cthulhu is it's not about, blow by blow role playing, is it? It doesn't involve, it does at times, but it doesn't involve, combat or detail. So you can say in a turn, right, okay, I'm going to go to the library and I'm going to look up these things, and then when I've looked up those things, I'm going to go to the newspaper and talk to the editor about this, this and this. And you can do quite a lot in a turn, can't you? With Cthulhu. Whereas other games, for example, the game of D&D I had, or other games even now, it's a trickier thing to do, isn't it? Because it's more small scale turns. I'm going to hit him with my sword. I'm
Yeah.
going to cast this spell, I'm going to do that, I'm going to do this. That's more difficult to play, even by email, I would say.
Yeah.
You know.
Bit more immediacy to email. I've been watching from afar Keyhart from Dissecting Worlds podcast. He's been running a Pendragon campaign with some of the podcast listeners. And that seems to work well because you've got the cyclical nature of Pendragon. And it kind of lends itself to that.
It's the type of game, isn't it?
Yeah.
The game is such that you can probably, I'm guessing, do quite a lot in a turn.
Yeah.
You know.
I keep saying I'll jump on and play, but with the fish finger situation and everything,
Better staying away from it.
But
I think another problem with it that is rolling of dice as well, because another aspect of a role-playing game that you miss is the rolling of dice.
And the immediacy of it.
The immediacy of that, and thinking, okay, right, I'm going to try and do this. Okay, right, you need a 10 or more, or you need an 18 or more, or something like that. You think, it's going to be difficult. Come on, let's roll the dice and see if we get it. But with the postal game, or even by play by email, you miss that, don't you?
Yeah.
Again, the beauty of Roll20 is it allows you to roll the dice. It allows you to see the dice roll and roll for damage and things like that. Whereas if it's done by post, it's slightly unsatisfactory to just get an email or a letter that says you take, 2d8 damage. What's it going to be? It's a 16. It's maximum damage.
Yeah.
Is it? I don't know. Not that you're saying that the Games Master is somehow cheating, but you don't see it rolled, do you? To not see the dice rolled, it somehow takes something out of the process, I think.
Yeah.
Takes something away from the enjoyment of it, I think.
Well, it might be something I will go back to. Like I say, I might jump onto that Pendragon game. But we're having so much fun with our online games and our face-to-face games at the moment. It probably isn't the right time.
Yeah, I'm not sure. I have sort of reservations about it.
Yeah.
I don't know. Does anyone actually play a postal game anymore? I can't imagine it. Would anyone play it? Would anyone do that? That's an interesting question, isn't it?
Yeah.
People out there, does anyone actually do postal gaming?
Yeah.
Or has everyone defaulted to? Surely they've all defaulted to email.
Well, Flying Buffalo are a play-by-mail company, so it'd be interesting if I do some research and find out.
I suppose like a commercial play-by-mail game, but I can't imagine an individual wanting to. I don't know, I might be wrong there, but
we'll find out.
We might find out.
It's time to leave the room of role-playing rambling for another occasion, and we'll come back next time. Then we're going to have a look at some fanzines, so looking forward to that.
All right.
Cheers, thanks Blythy.
See you, bye.
There isn't another bit.
Thanks to Shop on the Borderlands for providing a copy of DragonLords issue 7 for us to discuss, as my originals have got seagulls flying over them at Rake's Lane Tip, following my mum's 1991 clear rate. Thanks to Ian Marsh, who was very gracious about taking the time in his busy schedule as a Fighting 15's toy soldiers distributor to talk to me. There's more next time about his famous acrostic in White Dwarf and his contribution to Judge Dredd RPG and his own version of Doctor Who role-playing game and more. Also next time we'll be having a special postbag with me and Blythy looking at some of the listener suggestions of fanzines of note. It's not too late for you to send yours if you're listening to this as the show was published in July 2017. Send me an email at dirtthedice@gmail.com telling us about some of your favourites. This whole podcast is merely a ruse for me to have a fanzine of my own, and thanks to the Patreon campaign this is possible. The second Grognard Files fanzine will be available from November to all Patreons wherever you are in the world. It's shaping up to be fantastic. I mentioned last time that there's a contribution from Ken St. Andre. Well, you can add Liz Danforth to the list. If you want a copy, seek us out on Patreon or reach for the link in the grognardfiles.com. Joining the Patreon campaign this time at $1 is Joseph Scott, Robert Arcangeli and Simon Tonkis. Thanks for the support, guys. There's also a couple of new $5 backers too. And I like to give them something special from a table featured in the episode. So this time I'm going to go for one of my own, the encounter table from our original booklet we produced for the Sunstar PBM campaign. And one of the old school techniques we deployed to create the World of Racklash was to create a wandering monster table. So up front is Andy Young, who is going to face an encounter from Narwhal Forest, a place that was previously submerged beneath the ocean. Okay, let me roll for this then. And 6. So you've met a sharkman. So make him stay still because he has to keep moving. Okay, Dr. RPG Ian Griffith has increased his pledge to $5 a month. So he's going to head for the Kingdom of Barkar and the Keftelian Hills, where he meets a Bigfoot. There you go, Doc RPG. He's all yours. I might have fixed that one for you. Okay, thanks to everyone for their continued support. And the Grog Squad community, our own corner of fandom. Doc Griffiths is the games master for a forthcoming Grog meet in Manchester in November. He's running Paranoia, which was recently selected in a Patreon poll to be a subject in an end of year podcast. The Grog zine is being created over the next few weeks, and we have a number of online games for patrons lined up before the end of the year. RuneQuest, Gangbusters. Also, I'll be running Two-Headed Serpent online at the beginning of 2018. We're almost at our next stretch goal too, which will unleash Grog Squad merchandise. Fish finger! Adios, amigos.